This is the Aptitude Outdoors podcast, where we interview conservationists, hunters, anglers, and outdoorsmen and women to bring you the greatest stories, information, and advice from the best in the world. I don't know about you, but I always carry a knife. It doesn't matter what the situation is, I'm always reaching for a blade. Whether I'm out hunting in the backwoods, fishing on lakes and rivers, or simply cutting rope at camp. And when I need a tool, I want something that's quality, durable, and handmade right here in the USA. I know that's something you're looking for as well, so go to maloneknives.com and get yourself something that's going to last and look damn good too. I'm a huge fanatic for handmade, high-quality leather and canvas products. In my opinion, they last longer, hold up better to the abuses of travel, and honestly, they just look really cool. That's why I use Badger Claw Outfitters. They've been making handcrafted products for hunting, camping, and travel since 2011, and that's right up my alley. Best part is they're made right here in the USA and are guaranteed for life. They've got everything from gun leather, belts, custom knife sheaths, wallets, duffel bags, leather and canvas pouches, everyday carry items, and more. Badger Claw Outfitters, made in the USA, built for the wild. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Aptitude Outdoors podcast. Thanks for tuning back in, rocking another solo episode today. I've been reading a lot about the North American model of wildlife conservation, and there's a chapter that I'm going through right now that is really based on all of the great conservationists that you think of. There's like Theodore Roosevelt, George Bird Grinnell, Gifford Pinchot, etc., on and on. And, you know, it got me thinking. The introduction to the chapter was talking about the path that all these people took to be conservationists. And it made me think about how I got to the point where I am, where I'm like highly concerned with conservation. And it's funny because it all ends up being essentially the same story. So if you've been listening to the podcast for the last couple of years, you may have pieced together my story, but I don't think I've ever told it outright. And it's a weird story. It's not your typical story. So I'm just going to lay it out here, let you guys do with it what you will, because I feel like you can relate to this as well as someone who's hopefully learning more about conservation and being more interested in conservation. So it started when I was probably about 17, 16. Back then, as I am now, a very idealistic person. I just kind of like to be creative. I like to be expressive and do a lot of high output stuff. So music was a really easy avenue for that for me, especially as like a very young kid. I was in a heavy metal band and we did the typical thing. We set out on the road. I lived in a van with my band for essentially 3 years. We toured the country. We left Ohio. And previous to that, I'd never really traveled much. You know, we would do the occasional like family thing to Florida every 5 or 6 years through my childhood. And that would involve driving through stuff like West Virginia and the Appalachian Mountain Range. We never really like went anywhere else. It was always just the same place in Florida. So my experience of travel was going to the beach sometimes. And, you know, those trips are always, when you're a kid, you just remember them, or if at all, it's just like the long drive and you didn't really care what was going on outside because you're just sitting in a car, probably playing your Game Boy. And so by the time I turned 17, you know, throughout high school, I did a little stuff like we'd go to Hocking Hills. Me and my buddy Nate, we would go camping. Didn't know what we were doing. Didn't know anything about a sleeping pads or any like blow up mattress. We had no concept of any of this stuff. We went to Walmart. We bought tents. We bought like the cheapest sleeping bags. Back then, you could get a sleeping bag for like $14 or $15 and a tent for like $20. With inflation now, that's like absurd to even think about. So we would just go out there. We would bring lighter fluid. We'd start campfires. Again, no concept, but I loved it. It was so awesome. Burned the shit out of all of our food. It was the greatest of times before all this gear collection of guns and, hunting tools and all this stuff, fly fishing, all this crazy path that I've gone down. And then, so, I left for tour, long story short, traveled the country for 3 years. We visited everything. We did the whole East Coast multiple times. We traveled through the southern half of the United States, through Texas. First time I've ever been west of the Mississippi. We did Nevada, Arizona, California, Oregon, Washington. Basically did this gigantic loop around the outside of the U.S., and we hit some of the other states, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, all of it. And it just, to me, was like, holy shit, there is so much out there. I mean, that was my first time seeing big mountains, snow-covered peaks in the middle of summer, deserts, the redwood forest. I mean, I got all of this in like a very short period of time. We're talking like 1 week we're in Texas, and a week and a half later we're in the redwood forests, and then, 2, 3, 4 days later, we're in northern Washington seeing like all this insanely beautiful stuff, the Pacific Ocean. Just never had these experiences before. And it got me really like hooked on nature. Anytime we were not playing shows, we had tremendous amounts of time to kill. So my friend Nate and I, the rest of the band could give a shit less about the outdoors. They were just like sit in the van and chill. So my friend Nate and I, we'd go around these places in like t-shirts and jeans and like van skate shoes and wander around the redwoods. No maps, no compass, no idea what the hell we were doing. And we would get lost. We would be late for shows because we were just wandering around in these places. And just seeing these vast expanses just changed the way I thought about things. I just never knew that existed. To me, that was like National Geographic. I never was like, I'll be able to go see these places. And it really changed the trajectory of how I thought about things. And on the road, it's really boring. I've always been kind of, an oddball, I guess. I would read books while we were on the road. Everybody else played like video games. Like they had those, remember those things are like PSPs or whatever, the like PlayStation Game Boy things. Everybody had those. I had one. I bought one before tour so I'd have something to do. I'd literally played it like twice. I just had no interest in any of that shit. I'd read books about like human history and not so much wildlife, but just kind of get a grasp of like humanity. I feel like that's the age where you're like trying to figure life out, because everything that you've learned in school, you're out of school and you just don't care anymore. You're like, yeah, whatever, I'm gonna figure this shit out on my own. So I go through this whole era of just exploring, learning about the outdoors, seeing these wild places. And we get back from touring. I had a few bad experiences on the road with, just like shitty record labels and like shady fuckers that you just don't want anything to do with. Watching people around me just fall into like nasty drug habits, like just seeing dudes strung out for like 3-4 days doing like cocaine and shit. You're just like, this is fucked up. Like, I never tried any of the hard drugs, thankfully, because my personality is pretty like hardcore. So I'd probably be like a crackhead by now. But I just saw that and I was like, fuck this. I do not want anything to do with this. Like completely lost that passion, just seeing how destructive it was for a lot of people. And then I was asked recently, what does the outdoors mean to you? To me, the outdoors is everything. It's like the growth model that consumes the entrepreneur, or the unending drive that pushes the athlete to outperform the competition. It's the greatest teacher of life lessons, whether it be learning to accept that most things are out of your control, or that the trees, the rivers, the mountains move along whether you're there or not. It's the motivator that keeps me accountable to my physical and mental health, because if I don't have the strength and conditioning to do the things that I enjoy outdoors, whether they be hunting, fishing, backpacking, adventure racing, or tackling some long distance adventures, then everything becomes exponentially more difficult. Most importantly, the outdoors allows me to be, to think, to exist in the same plane that the majority of the natural world still exists in. To break the bonds from what we call civilization. The outdoors is freedom, a place where life and death are one and the same. The prime example of what it means to exist. In my mind, there's no separation. The outdoors simply is, as all things should be, perfection in its most chaotic form. The outdoors is you, it's me, it's all of us.
I get back home, I start working this job at a concrete factory, and I've just absolutely hated it more than anything. Oh God, it was like at 19 working 60, 70, 80 hours a week, just the fucking nastiest job ever, in my opinion. I hated it. So I went back to school. I decided that's what got my ass in gear to go to college. And I've just never been a person who is like, I need to go to college so that I can get a degree to get a better job. Like, that didn't even occur to me. I was so interested in learning about stuff that I went to college because I was interested in learning. And for me, an anthropology degree fit really well because I got to learn a lot about human history, and they had a lot of focus on environmental anthropology, like how humans impact the environment that we live in, the world. And you obviously, if you ever listen to anything, that hugely impacted how I think about things personally. So I went through that whole thing. I paid that all off. I worked full time and did that. And I just had this new understanding of how the world works and how the world has previously worked, like human history, like we're talking human evolution all the way up through modern times. Like, that just blew my mind because they don't teach you that shit, especially at a Catholic school. You like, they're required to teach you about human evolution, but they don't like really push it any more than they have to because they don't want you to think about that. They want you to be like very religious in how you view the world, which is whatever. I don't give a shit either. But I went down that path of learning about human evolution, and then I started learning about how humans in the environment for the majority of the time we've been on this planet, we're like very much intertwined. Like, we were living in nature. We lived in the outdoors, and it's only been in the last few hundred years that we've kind of like had this image that we're a part of nature. And especially in like modern society, people view that they're like separate from nature, which is absolute horseshit. And that really got me thinking. And then, you know, we learn about all these people and these cultures that had these rites of passage when you turn, you know, anywhere from, you know, puberty to maybe 18 or so. You go on these journeys, you go on this like very difficult thing. And that's when you go from becoming like a boy or a young girl to a man or a woman. You do these difficult things. And we don't do that anymore. It's just like, I feel like that's so ingrained in being a human, and we just don't do it. So I was like, I'm going to do this. And that's where the idea to through hike the Appalachian Trail came through. I was like, you know, I'm not a guy who's like all about fitness or running. I hated all that shit. But I was like, this is going to be probably the hardest thing that I will ever do. And I need to do it now before I have like a job, a career path or whatever. And that was like a vital time in my life because I had graduated college and I knew I was not going to work at that concrete factory any a second longer than I had to. So I quit after, you know, a lot of deliberation. I mean, they tried to get me to stay. They were like offering me way more money and shit. And I was like, I cannot do this. As a person, I will not do this for the rest of my life. And I just made it like kind of drew a line in the sand there, and I left for the Appalachian Trail. Through hike the Appalachian Trail, you know, that was a very pivotal time for me. I feel like that's where I finally understood who I am and what I give a shit about. And because all you do is walk and think. You're like a freaking Walden or something, or fucking, you know, like John Muir. You're just walking around thinking, not I'm comparing myself to John Muir. I'm just like, understand how they come to these thoughts. It's like all you do all day is walk around and think, and you're in nature. And so I was like, this is really fucking important to me. Like, this is the most important thing to me. seeing these wild places interspersed throughout the East Coast, which the East Coast of the United States is insanely more populated than the rest of the country, especially like once you get past the Mississippi River, it's so much more sparsely populated. And it just changed my brain forever. It had to have rewired it. And I'm like, man, these natural places are badass. And, that journey was very mentally and physically difficult. And I've never really spoken on it in detail just because it would be a 40-part podcast series to talk about my adventure on the Appalachian Trail, which, I'm over that. Like, it was a thing I did and I loved it. And for a lot of people, that's like the shining achievement of their life. And for me, it was like, I'm just warming up. Like, this is the catalyst for what I want to do forever. And so I really, really pushed myself to try and find a job in wildlife or in the parks or something when I got home. You get home and you're broke as fuck and you don't have anything. You're like, we're living in this shitty fucking house that we were renting and it was just terrible. Like no carpet, like wooden floor because it's like we had nothing. So we're like rebuilding. So I took a job at the Metro Parks as a seasonal worker, and there I learned a lot about wildlife. And if you step back to when I was in high school, they have those stupid bullshit things you read when those tests you give. They're like, this is what you want to be when you grow up. And I was like, I just want to be a naturalist. I want to be like a guy who does outdoor stuff. There's no direction there. And whatever. It's not a very common thing that kids want to be. And so I can't really, I don't put any blame on like high school. I was told, if I really cared that much, I would have pursued that or figure out how to pursue that. So it's like, you fast forward, I get this job as a, seasonal outdoors skills worker. I don't remember what the title was, whatever, who gives a shit. It's like, so I learned about more access to recreational things like kayaking. I learned about the natural resources we have here where I live in Northwest Ohio, like rare ecosystems. I learned a ton about trees and the wildlife that lives here. And it was like a very condensed course because you're not only learning, but you're teaching others about them. And for me, I take that shit real serious. Like if you ever go on my Instagram, you see how many damn books I'm reading all the time, and they're all about wildlife and the outdoors. And so I got this like primer in how to paddle correctly. I got this primer on how to like understand ecosystems and nature. And then, that job was very low paying. So I'm like, at this point, I'm pushing like 25, 26 maybe. And I'm like, I can't work for, $9 an hour for the rest of my life. It's just not feasible. So I take a job at a water conservation organization. And I worked there for a couple of years. And that's kind of how I learned more about how entwined water is with ecosystems and how delicate that balance is. And I got to meet a lot of really great people through that organization. But again, it's just like the money is not there sometimes, especially around here. Like the money's not there in those organizations. So I couldn't just hang on to that forever. And it was only a part-time job. So I took this job at an elevator company because they were paying a shitload more money. And I figured after a lot of deliberation, I would be better off having a job where I made more money and had like health insurance and shit because I'm not getting any younger. And oh my God, I hated it. I was in an office all day, which for anybody who knows me in person knows that is not my jam. I am not built for that shit. I am very much like from my heavy metal background, have like authoritarian issues. Like I just don't like people telling me what to do ever. And it pisses me off. So I just was like, all right, I gotta do this for me and my family. I have to just grit this shit out, which, I've gritted out plenty of shit. The Appalachian Trail being one example, working 80 hours, 60, 70 hours a week on average through college. And so, I was like, I just got to grit this out, just store up some cash. So I did that. That's when I really, really, really got all my camera equipment and all that stuff. And I really was able to upgrade a lot of like what you see now, like lighting and a lot of my outdoors equipment, because it was a pretty good paying job. But again, I don't give a shit about finance, and I just couldn't handle it. I just could not mentally be in that place. So I did that for about 2.5 years. A little bit before that, I skipped a whole chunk of my life that I forgot about. I had an outdoors television show on a local network here. It was called Take It Outside, and we basically just roamed around Northwest Ohio and filmed a bunch of stuff, talked to like local wildlife experts, local recreation stuff, mountain biking, kayaking. There's a group here called Mountain Menors. I actually went with them to New Hampshire and filmed an episode in the mountains, taking these, like troubled youth on this backpacking trip. And it's like very life-changing for these kids, and like just exploring local nature. And that's kind of what got me to start the podcast after going through this job. I was like, I loved doing the media side of things. I got to learn, I got to talk to people. And I was like, well, I didn't know what a podcast was. I'd never listened to a podcast in my life. And then I started this podcast while at that elevator job. And also after the TV show kind of fell apart. And like, it was just a continuation of the television show, but I just had a one-on-one interview time with someone, like an expert in the shit that I love, for an hour. And, obviously that has evolved greatly over time. I went from doing it like once every couple of weeks to twice a month to weekly. And now I'm even starting to push that a little more. And I just really love learning from these experts. And, if you watch the progression, the guests have potentially gone up in like scale and expert level, which is a natural progression. And, now I really like, this is what I do. I love it. Like, this podcast isn't my full-time job. I know a lot of people think that, and I don't want to I guess I've been giving that false impression for a long time now, that like, this is not my full-time job. I guess I just don't, I have a full-time job. I'm a media director, and I do all of their media. So I run all of their advertising and marketing, and I run all of their video. I do all of their video trainings. I do their podcast. Actually, yesterday I was gone from 5 a.m. until I got home at 10 p.m. We recorded 5 episodes yesterday. So I talked a lot yesterday. So a little mentally burnt out. And that kind of just, I woke up this morning and got me thinking about what got me here. And, I really love doing this podcast because it's opened up so many opportunities for me, and my job is like gracious enough to give me a lot of flexibility. That's why you see me doing so much outdoor stuff, because I'm allowed to work on my own schedule, which is like, for me, as who I am as a person, the best thing that could ever happen, because I don't want to give myself some like bullshit diagnosis, but I'm like very much ADHD in the way that I am. And I know my brother has ADHD, so it's likely that there's a hint of that there. But I'm very much all over the place, and I like to do a lot of things at once. Like right now, we're doing this podcast. I'm doing all my normal job. I'm helping my friend Derek York with the Hunt Fish Podcast Summit, like with their marketing and stuff, and trying to help him find guests and sponsors. I read a shitload. I'm working on documentaries with my friend Seth Geib. I like to travel and hunt all the time, and I just do my work when I'm not doing those things. Like, I do it every day. I'm not just like fucking off all the time, but like that allows me to pursue the things that I really love. And that's kind of where I'm at right now. And I really am just, I'm tired. I do a lot of freaking work, but I love wildlife. And it's like that path, that long, weird path, got me to the mindset that I have now about conservation being key. Because after the Appalachian Trail, I'm jumping all over the place. Back to my ADHD statement. I was looking for another long distance adventure, and a lot of people either never thru hike again, which is probably the scenario that I will be in, or they go to complete like the Triple Crown, or they do the PCT or something like that. It wasn't in the books for me. That shit is so expensive, and I don't have sponsors and stuff like that. So I was looking for something local that I could do. So my friends and I that I met through the parks, we kayaked the Maumee River, which is 137 miles, which is very uncommon. Not a lot of people do it. It's not a very like well received river because it's muddy. They call it the Muddy Maumee, but I think it's a beautiful river and it has a lot of like ecologically diverse stuff going on there. And it's like a really, really awesome success story, even though there's still a lot of problems. So I want to see that shit for myself. So we went out, we made a TV show about that. And then from there, it was like, I read, and you guys have heard me talk about this quite a bit, the book, The Last American Man by Eustace Conway. He also thru hiked the Appalachian Trail, and he was like, he like lives off the land. He's just like a mountain man. And that kind of got me into hunting. I was very much not interested in hunting for a long time. So, there's this natural progression. I got into like fishing, and that's like, I love fishing. It's probably one of my favorite activities ever. And that's like just a different kind of intensive, but hunting is like ultra intensive. And it just me as my personality, I just love ultra intensive stuff. Just like, I don't know why. The more brutal, the more time and labor intensive it is, I just love it. And so that's how I got to this point of like being a hunter, being a fisherman, and being finally the last piece of that puzzle as a conservationist, because this big, vast spans of experiences I've had over a lifetime made me be like, well, none of this matters if we don't conserve it or preserve it, which, depending on when this episode comes out, I have a discussion with Gabriella Hoffman, who is the District of Conservation podcast host, and she very, very much so details the difference between conservation and preservation. And I also have a detailed breakdown of that in the episode I did last year with Gray Thornton, CEO of the Wild Sheep Foundation. So if you want to learn more about that, you can go check out that episode or the upcoming or already released episode. I don't know. And so like that really became a very important thing to me. And it is right now very important. And I do read a lot about it and study a lot about it and research a lot about it and talk to people a lot about it. And that's kind of why the podcast has changed so drastically over the years. But I think that's like the most important thing right now is getting to that, I don't want to say final step, but that step where it's like it all comes together full circle. Like I started outdoors because I liked having fun, and then it came around and it got more intensive and more intensive the more I learned and the more like I understand ecosystems and how animals work and that hunting isn't the devil. And then now we're back to the beginning of it's important because without the main piece being wildlife, wild places, etc., none of this can happen. So that's how this podcast became a conservation podcast, and that's how I got to that conclusion. And I feel like anybody who spends an inordinate amount of time in the outdoors will kind of come to that eventually on their own as well. Even if you're a wildlife photographer, which is something I also just love to do, you're going to ultimately care about conservation because like you take a picture of a bird that you've never seen before, a rare bird, and you read a little internet blob about it. And you're like, oh shit, this bird is highly, endangered or something. And then you start to care and then you start to get involved and you've just followed that same path. Mine's a little more wild and zigzagged, but that's how it is. So I hope you guys, learned something from my story of epic adventure and failure. Like during that multiple decade and a half, I fucked up a lot of shit. I went from like highest of highs to lowest of lows, like being more money than I knew what to do with to broke as shit. And it's just a repeating cycle. But like at this point, all I care about is conservation and the outdoors and wildlife and, working my best to try to help conserve in the best way that I can, which is doing what I'm doing right here. And I know it doesn't, in my brain, it doesn't seem like it is that impactful, but it's like, to me, I feel like that's what I'm good at and what my calling is to do. So I'm doing it the best I can and the most that I can to the best of my ability. So I'll stop rambling here. I hope you guys enjoy this episode. Again, I'll be doing more solo episodes to kind of supplement some of the stuff I'm talking about and just ideas that I have, and to kind of just relate to you guys that, you know, you can do anything you want. You just have to be willing to push a little bit and, you know, get outside of your damn head, because I'm in my head all the damn time and it's really annoying. And I overthink things usually sometimes, and I get myself frustrated. But if you can help me out, you know, go on iTunes and rate the podcast. That's really, I know I ask that on every episode, but that's the only way to really get to grow at this point, is just getting people out there that appreciate what I'm doing, letting other people know about it. Even if you just tell a friend about the podcast, I'd greatly appreciate that. And then if you could subscribe to this YouTube channel too, I would love that as well. And I really am grateful to everybody who's been sticking with me through all these years. I know this podcast has been all over the damn place, but I'm trying my best to focus down a little bit more. But it's hard for me. I love to talk about this shit. So thank you guys. I'll see you soon with another episode.